Prutow, I'm going to let a few of these tennis serves go by and won't use my whole 10 minutes in asking you questions, just have one or two. On ascendaton, I agree, by the way, that it's quite common in Greek for you to be able to use 2 or 3 words to describe the same thing, whether it's hendiatus or tridiatus and so forth, kind of a thing. Just want to know if you think that the fact that the 3 words appear in ascendaton necessitates that they be a reference to the canonical psalms, or is it also possible they're a reference to 3 different categories of music that are simply placed together to refer qualitatively? So do you see that as sort of an open and shut case, or a place where the greater weight of the opinion leans one way than it does the other?
I would say the greater weight of the opinion weighs in the direction of the canonical psalms. And it's not just that we have ascendaton here, but it's how the language, I would say, is used in the Septuagint and in other references in the Old Testament, where the idea of song, for example, when David instituted song in the tabernacle in 1 Chronicles 16, the idea of song there is, it seems, in context, a reference to the Psalms, because you have an inclusio in 1 Chronicles 16, where the writer speaks about the institution, David's institution, at the beginning of the chapter and at the end of the chapter, and then the example of selected psalm portions that are given in the middle of the chapter. So the idea of songs there appears clearly to be a reference to the Psalter, since the Psalter is quoted there. And you have the same idea in other texts, it seems. So I would say the weight goes to, it's not just the fact that it's the figure of speech there.
And then a point that we all agree with, you cited Voss especially, and to a lesser degree Calvin. I think you and I, and probably everyone in this room, agrees that every good, even hymn writer that we've ever known, even for those who don't use them in worship, I think we all agree that all great hymn writers have read the Psalms avidly and have drunk deeply of the Psalms, and their hymns attempt in a more overtly Christian way to manifest the same realities of the Psalter. So I resonate with what Voss said. However, if Calvin concurred that, did not Voss use language, hard to find a more perfect guide to our subjective reaction to God's work, something like that? I just want to toss it out and see if you want to, and you don't have to if you don't want to. So just toss the tennis ball out there. If Calvin concurred that they were a perfect guide, why would he have employed the Nunc Dimittis, the Creed, and the Decalogue in the Strasbourg liturgy?
Great question. I'm not sure I can answer that. He didn't. It's obvious that those New Testament songs, if you want to characterize them this way, were included in Calvin's liturgy, and he wanted to use them. And particularly the Decalogue, I think for the purpose of memorizing the Decalogue, that was probably Calvin's idea there, because he held the law in great esteem, as we know, and wanted the people to understand the law. Outside of that, I think it's a great question.
So, and possibly, when people say, could we find a more perfect guide? Sometimes we use that language, perfect, maybe not with a capital P, but with a small p. Hard to imagine, humanly speaking, a better guide, but possibly a little here and there. And maybe Calvin had a small p kind of understanding of the same thing, and Voss more a capital P.
Yeah,
that's possible. And by the way, I don't know if the RPA does this, because I don't know if you're permitted to, but in the current edition of the Red Trinity hymnal, the musical setting of the Decalogue there is the Geneva musical setting. That's why it's so difficult for people to sing. because it's an old Renaissance melody. Da 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 da. A very, very odd kind of a thing. And when we say, why did they choose that difficult melody, the answer is it's the Genevan melody that Calvin used. And so they just put it into English meter and did it there. So there are others also finding it memorable when you put it to music. I only had a third one, and that is this. Let's concede that it's possible that the songs, hymns, and psalms, spiritual, is a reference to the Old Testament canonical psalms. I'll try to demonstrate later that why I'm not persuaded. But do you care to answer my mention to the 3 times that Luke says the book of the Psalms? Would that not have been an easier, less corrigible, less debatable way for Paul to have referred to the Psalms had he wanted to? Or am I the only one that feels a little weight there?
It would seem to me that in the Gospels, Luke's reference is referring to the Psalms. It's not necessary for him to narrow the idea as closely as it appears, at least I would argue the case, as Paul's interest implies in Colossians 3:16, that in the Gospels the Old Testament quotations are given to us in several different ways, and the term fulfilled is used in several different ways. And so it's a little hard for us sometimes to distinguish how the texts are used. But at any rate, I think Luke's interest there is simply to refer to the Psalter. This is what is given to us in the Old Testament. Whereas in the case of Colossians 3:16, it appears to me at least that Paul's interest is to narrow the scope of our singing. And he does so purposefully, you see. Mm-hmm. And so that's his idea. And I would submit then that the reason he does this is the power of music, which we would properly understand and agree about, and the necessity, therefore, to narrow the scope of our singing and give certain parameters to the church so that the church is not off doing, quote, its own thing, but really concentrating on letting this word of Christ dwell richly within them so that the image of Christ really begins to be built in them. And again, it seems to me that this is where Voss is going with his idea of subjective response.
And then the final one, because it flows right out of that, in terms of this God's objective work and our subjective response, the citations you made from Voss and others, do you grant any weight that it might have been useful if we'd have had some such biblical text dealing with some aspect of the person and work of Christ overtly? A biblical guide that actually speaks as overtly about the work of Christ as the Psalms speak overtly about Babylonian captivity and only implicitly about Christ.
See, I would argue that the Psalms do not speak only implicitly about Christ, but that the Psalms do speak directly about Christ, and the witness would be that our Lord himself and the apostles preach Christ from the Old Testament and preach Christ from the Psalms. Jesus on the Emmaus Road, he spoke to the disciples all the things concerning himself from the Psalms and the prophets and Moses. And so I would say that no, it's not just implicit reference, but explicit reference.
Mr. Moderator, I'm done with my questions. Have no tennis balls to swing at.
We're going to proceed then to Dr. Prutow's examination of Dr. Gordon. Dr. Gordon, you may take the stand.
You may take the witness stand.
Your Honor, I never saw the woman before in my life.
Oh, please. I'm interested in your talking a little bit more about the fact that you hold that the Israelites, as you wrote in a recent article, were not exclusive psalm singers.
Yeah, some of you are familiar that I wrote a little thing, the Israelites were not exclusive song singers, nor are we, and Dr. Prutow is referring to that particular essay. In that essay, I suggested that if you look at the historical books of the Old Testament, you'll find a number of times where there's the recording of some song of praise. We think especially of the Song of Deborah, the Song of Moses, and so forth, the Song of the Sea, that are never found in the canonical Psalter, and yet the Israelites did sing them. And the narrator seems to suggest, when he narrates that they did so, that he approves of the fact that they sang them. So it appears that there were many things they sang that, as it were, made it into the Psalter, other things they sang that were not placed in the Psalter. And so what I suggest is that the Psalter was always a growing revision, the way we revise our hymnals, or the way, for instance, the RP&A, 6 years ago or 7, completed the revision of the RP&A Psalter from the old Brown version to the new one, that the process was never final. The process was always ongoing. So that's all I suggest, is that it doesn't appear to me that they would have stopped composing new hymns until Yahweh stopped new acts of creation or deliverance.
So your argument, if I understand what you're saying, your argument, at least in part, rests on the fact that the Israelites, in response to great acts of God, the Exodus and Exodus 15,
And the conquest of the land, the Song of Deborah,
etc. Those kinds of songs militate against the fact that the Israelites were. I'm correct in my thinking there.
Yeah, that's right. My reason is that they wouldn't have closed their hymnal until they closed their canon.
They wouldn't have closed their. Enlighten us on that idea just a little bit.
That is to say, one of the wonderful things about Voss's observation is the Psalter provides for us the right subjective response to God's objective acts. Right? That's what's going on existentially with them. That's what's going on. And so as long as God is doing unusual acts, not his more ordinary acts of providence, but his special acts of delivering his people from their enemies and so forth, I would have expected, as long as there's an ongoing record of his doing such things, we would expect that they would respond to that ongoing record with devotional expressions of thanksgiving and praise for those activities. And so that if God stopped acting, they would have no reason to compose new ones, perhaps. But if he were to continue such acts, that they would have continued to sing about them.
Okay. Then I take it that you would draw no distinction between occasional times of God's people gathering, and I would use the term occasional with reference to the gathering of God's people after they crossed the Red Sea, and Miriam led them in worship. It was on that occasion that they worshiped God. And you mentioned Deborah. This kind of occasional worship and the regular stated worship of God's people in the temple, that you're not making any distinction between those two.
I'm open to the distinction because at least our standards make that distinction in chapter 21 on the regular versus the occasional elements of worship. So baptism we can't do every week if we don't have a candidate for baptism. So we call that an occasional element of worship, and the other things we call regular elements of worship. So I have no problem theologically with that distinction. But what I see in Israel is that throughout her life, as important moments come along, and this is all the way over to later in the Habakkuk we have one, for instance, all the way through, they seem to compose devotional compositions that grow out of their subjective response to God's objective act. And so what we then see in the canon is the collecting of what they regard to be as a representative group of those.
I'm drawing the distinction between certain occasions where God's people gathered and sang praise to God, and the formal stated worship that was designed by God in the temple.
Versus more special occasions like the inauguration of a governor or something like that.
Correct. Or like a 4th of July celebration. And it was in the temple, in the stated worship of God, where David initiated the use of the Psalms. And then later in 2 Chronicles, so I just get your reaction to this. Later in 2 Chronicles, when Hezekiah revived the true worship of God in accordance with David. This is 2 Chronicles 29:30. It says, "And Hezekiah the king and the officials commanded the Levites to sing praises to the Lord with the words of David and Asaph the seer."
Oh, that's very helpful.
And it seems, just before you respond, it seems that what Hezekiah is doing is narrowing, again, the song which is permissible in the temple services. And this is why drawing the distinction between the temple services, which are highly regulated, and occasional settings.
Yeah, let me have the reference.
2 Chronicles 29:30. And earlier text speaks about Hezekiah reviving the worship in accordance with the prophet Nathan, and etc.
Yeah, that helps. That's much clearer than I might have thought the question was. Here's the analogy. There's two possibilities here. One possibility, as you suggest, is that they are at this point issuing sort of an ongoing directive that, let's say, from this moment on, the Levites are to sing praises to the Lord with the words of David and Asaph the seer, and perhaps no others. And that's entirely possible. I think
in the temple service.
Right. I also think there's two other possibilities, and that is that when the Levites, who are but a type of the coming work of Christ, when their work gives way to the mediation of Christ, and the people of God, not just 1/12 of the people of God, but all the people of God come there, that just as our general life is not as highly regulated as the life of the Levites was, because they were much more regulated than the other 11 tribes, it's quite possible that our worship is less precisely regulated than theirs was. We don't have the stuff on our hems of our garments and so forth. But more important, I think, is this. A command to do a thing does not necessarily imply negatively that they not do anything else. Last Sunday night, I was filling the pulpit. At my size, I was trying to fill the pulpit at a church in Grove City. And when I finished with the sermon and the prayer, I instructed the congregation to stand and sing hymn number 230, "Thou who was rich beyond all splendor, all for love's sake becamest poor." Now, in instructing them to sing that hymn on that occasion, I don't know that I was instructing them not to sing anything else. So the other question I have is, here we have a candid record that they commanded the Levites to do this, right? But I'm not sure logically it means that their intention was that they never do anything else. Just not sure that that's implicit in it, any more than that my selecting one hymn to be sung on that occasion necessarily meant that that was the only one out of 700 hymns in there that they could sing. They might could have sung others by other people.
We have 2 minutes? Huh. We were behind. You see, I would say, just in responding to that, to me that's counterintuitive as far as the reading of the text is concerned.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm done.
Dr. Prutow wants another break.
Are you going to give me one now?
time for rebuttal and closing. You have 15 minutes.
Let me just say a few words that I think pertain to the matter of the language of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs that we've each alluded to. And I'll probably post this at some point if you're interested, and if your Bible searching program doesn't pull Greek and Hebrew up easily, I can do that for you. But let me suggest that when you look at each of those three terms, as they are used in the Old Testament, Psalmos, Psalms, translated there, Psalms, Psalmos appears 92 times. 41 times it appears as a title or partial title of a canonical psalm. 51 times it does not. And so it sometimes is used as a title of a canonical psalm, sometimes not. Hymnos appears 32 times, 5 times as a title to a canonical psalm, and 27 times not as a title to a canonical psalm. Ode, song in our songs spiritual, appears 85 times in the Greek Old Testament, 15 times in the title of Psalms, and 70 times elsewhere. Now, in addition to the fact that those terms are used frequently not in the titles of Psalms, there are other expressions that are also used to designate canonical psalms that do not show up in Colossians 3:19. Eistotelos appears 56 times as a psalm title. Now, psalmos only appears 41 times as a psalm title. So the most frequent way of titling a psalm in the Greek Old Testament is eistotelos. And then suneseos appears 18 times as a title to a psalm. So hymnos appears 5, Ode 5, hymnos 15. This term appears 18. So there's two terms used as titles of psalms in the Greek Old Testament more frequently than two of the three terms that Paul uses here as titles of psalms, and yet Paul does not use them. Now, to me, what that means is all 5 or 6 of these kinds of terms were in a state of flux at this point and had not yet become fixed as terms that designate only canonical psalms. And so in addition to my understanding of what the word of Christ means and what pneumatikos, the adjective spiritual, means, is also the fact that I do not regard the 3 terms that Paul happens to select as an intentional ascendaton to refer to canonical psalms. Had I done so, I would have taken the 3 most common titles for psalms: eistotelos 50-some times, psalmos 42, and then suneseos 18. Those would have been the 3 that I did. So 2 of the 3 most frequent terms that refer to canonical psalms in the Greek Old Testament are not used in Colossians 3:19. And one of the ones that he uses is only used 5 times out of 150 to refer to a canonical psalm. Only twice in the 150 canonical psalms are all 3 terms used. Because as you know, in some of the titles, the title is nearly as long as a Puritan book. It'll call things 4, 5, 6, 7 things. And so there are 2 psalms in the Greek Old Testament where psalmos and hymnos and ode appear, but only 2 out of 150. And I would simply say 2 out of 150 is not a fixed enough amount of usage to then designate the thing as a terminus technicus, which is sort of a coded way of saying canonical psalms. I would still prefer that we use Luke's language, and by the way, I wasn't clear earlier, Dr. Prutow, it's actually Luke's usage in Acts where he calls it the book of Psalms. That's where those references appear, not in Luke. So I just suggest that it is not clear at all to me that by the time that Paul writes Colossians 3, that those 3 terms, which are sometimes used for titles, were code speech that meant canonical psalms. There were other words used more frequently as titles of psalms than them, and had that been what Paul wished to convey, he would have taken the 3 most frequently appearing titles and ranked them in that order, and that would have made it clear to people that that's what he's doing. So that's the only thing. I think we've covered most of the areas where thoughtful people have to wrestle with both aspects of this part of the regulative principle tradition, but I did want to give you those kind of numbers out there for those of you who like that. And if I don't post it on my webpage and you want to see those all printed out, if you email me, it's just tdgordon@gcc.edu. I'm happy to send you that information, because some of your search programs don't permit you to search Greek or Hebrew words, only English words. And so what I've done is I've printed the English text, but as the result of a search of the Greek words. So even if your Greek's a little rusty, you'd still be able to read the texts and follow fine. Mine's worse than rusty, but at my age, it was once sharp, and so even when it's rusty, it's pretty good.
If you're rusty, brother, I'm moving much more slowly. Professor Gordon, referring to the psalm titles and tois telos, used in the Septuagint as one of the psalm titles. Unto the end is the idea of the psalm title. And if you have a Bible there and you want to look at Psalm 4 and the title, Psalm 4 begins with, for the choir director, on stringed instruments, a psalm of David. And it's the words for the choir director that are translated in the Septuagint, eis to telos.
Yes, some translations choir master and some choir director.
Correct. And apparently the translators of the Septuagint were looking at the Psalms eschatologically. This seems to be part of the emphasis. And the title, then, in this part, is not telling us the form of what is being written. And in one of his articles, Dr. Gordon points out the use of the term form in the church, which I think is helpful. In other words, we use a certain form when we utter the Lord's Prayer or repeat the Lord's Prayer. And we use certain forms in baptisms and church membership, etc. The idea in the title that it's a psalm is indicating to us the form, I would say. And so I think you have to be careful in not mixing apples and oranges is part of what I'm saying. In part, the title is telling us the emphasis of the psalm or the direction the psalm is going or for whom it is written or by whom it is to be used, etc. And then it's telling us that it's a psalm or a song or a hymn, giving us two different things. And so I think to say that the idea of eis to telos utilized more frequently than the terminology psalm or song or hymn is a little misleading in this regard. This takes us, I think, to the idea of the Psalter being eschatological in its emphasis. And you get this immediately, don't you, in the very first psalm. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season. Its leaf does not wither, and whatever he does prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment. See? Boom, all of a sudden we're to the judgment and the idea of judgment. So the beginning of the Psalter gives us an eschatological slant immediately. And it appears that this is part of the idea in the titles to which Professor Gordon was referring, you see, that the Septuagint writers saw the Psalter as eschatological. Now, I would submit that the New Testament writers, under the divine guidance of the Holy Spirit, saw the Psalter as eschatological also. And for this reason, they freely quoted the Psalter with reference to Christ and the beginning of the age to come, you see, and other matters that have to do with that which is yet to come, the judgment which is to come. And so the Psalter itself is eschatological and gives us this perspective. Now, there's another aspect here that we didn't touch upon, and I think would be fun for us to discuss, and that is typology. And the idea being here is that, no, I don't want to sing about types of Christ. I want to sing about the reality. Well, again, I would submit that in the Psalter, we do sing about the reality, Christ himself. We also do sing about types and shadows. But this is not uncommon. Walter Kaiser has a very helpful little book, which he calls Back to the Future. And in that little book, he explains, I think rightly, that the only way that we can speak about the future is by utilizing things, symbols, ideas from the past or from the present. And this is how the Bible works, that the people of Israel were only able to speak about the future utilizing that which was in their past or that which was in their present. And since we are not yet in the future, it's a little bit hard for us to define explicitly that future. And we can say, well, we'll look at the book of Revelation. Okay, good. Many symbols, much typology. How does the book of Revelation speak to us about the future? By using symbols and types from Israel's past. This is the only way that it could be done. And it's quite striking. I don't know if you've read Dr. Gordon's little book, Why Johnny Can't Sing Hymns. I think it's a helpful book. And in one place where he talks about poetry having staying power and old hymns having staying power because they're used over the years, I say amen, and I put in my margin, think about the Psalms. They have staying power. They have staying power. And this is part of the genius of the book, you see. And even in modern hymns, we sing about, O Lamb of God. Well, what is that? It's a type. It's a type. And unless the type is explained, then the people don't understand the hymn, you see. So we're not carried away from the whole idea of types and shadows and symbols if we move to modern hymnody away from the ancient Psalter, which in the words of Voss again, no better words can be framed for our use in our approach to God. And I didn't get a chance to say this in the interaction, but I don't think Voss is using hyperbole there. I think he does mean what he says in that instance. Time?
You're good.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.